So I'm not sure exactly how much you learned about Volozhin and how far you got with it, but let's backtrack a little bit to the time before Volozhin. And before Volozhin, there were no formal yeshivas. Of course, there are many yeshivas always in Klal Yisrael. There were no formal yeshivas in the sense that there was no central place where people went and stayed several years and were trained to be Rabbonim or Rosh Yeshiva. People used to gravitate to different Rabbonim. The Rabbonim had their own personal yeshivas in various different towns, wherever they were Rabbonim, and they had those yeshivas while they were alive. Sometimes even they continued on for many generations, but they were not central. And nobody said, "I learned in this and that yeshiva." They said, "I learned by this and that Rav." That was how I got my education. Along came Reb Chaim Volozhin in the early 1800s and suggested to his Rebbe, to the Vilna Gaon, that they needed now to have a central institution for all of Lithuania, at least, where people would come and would be educated and develop themselves in learning. Now, the Vilna Gaon agreed to this, and he thought it was a good idea, and therefore Reb Chaim went ahead and did it. The Volozhin was not like the yeshivas we have today. It did not have a dormitory. It did not have meals. They just had a big building, like a shul, where everybody came together and learned. Everybody found lodgings in the city, and they found places to eat. It was a famous concept called Essen Teg, which means you ate this day by this person, another day by another person. You found, and the yeshiva gave you a certain amount of money to pay for these lodgings and to pay for the meals.
They didn't have a dormitory?
No, there's no dormitory. No, the dormitories came about. It was a much later invention. I believe the first one was in Telshe. I might be mistaken about that, but it was a much later invention. Even then, the idea of a central dining room was still much later than that. People, even they had dormitories and still go to various different people's places to eat. Now, Volozhin was structured different than the yeshivas we have today, in the sense that they used to learn straight through all of Shas, which means all of Talmud Bavli, in the course of 6 years, which is a little bit less, a little bit more than a daf a day. The daf only 7.5 years, took them 6 years, and the shir would be on the daily daf. And of course, there was other shirim as well that Netziv famously gave later on a Chumash shir from which the Hamek Dover developed. But there are various different shirim, I assume, besides that. But you stayed in the yeshiva as long as you wanted, usually until you finished the cycle of Shas, and then you went on. There was no such thing as a kollel at that time. If you wanted to continue learning after you got married, you found somebody who would accept to support you a certain amount of years as a son-in-law, and you would live in that town under that person's roof, and you would learn either by yourself or later on the concept of a kollel, where people came together actually to learn in groups. But a lot of times what happened with kollel was that the wife would stay home and she would stay by her parents. People got married pretty young, and they would, the chassan would leave home for several years, come back if he could, they could afford it for Yom Tovim, and go learn in what was called a kollel prushim. Kollel prushim means they were separated from their wives. They went back occasionally until after several years they had mastered whatever they went to study, and then came back home again.
How many years did they go away from?
2 or 3. So, but right, yes, yeah. You have to understand that you got married as teenagers usually. Later on, this changed.
The boys and the boys and
Both, yeah.
How old were the girls?
What? 13, 14. 13, 14. The boys are 15, 16. People got married young. It was a lot of people also were not officially married in the sense of the government, because the government had quotas on how many Jews could get married. So a lot of times they need to get married young in order to escape the government's surveillance. So the government wouldn't know that people are getting married, since Jews are not supposed to get married except a severely limited amount. But the event.
The government didn't want them to get married because they didn't want them to have kids?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So the Netziv himself, he got married at the age of 16. His wife was younger than that, obviously. So the idea was, even after Volozhin was founded, it was an yeshiva like we had today. Yeshivas like we have today developed towards the end of the 19th century. This is at the beginning of the 19th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, that's when yeshiva started developing, and again, gradually developed over time. The first modern yeshiva, in the sense that it had levels, first year shir, second year shir, and so on and so forth, was Tels. In Tels, they actually went from level to level to level until finally they reached Rosh Yeshiva shir. In Volozhin, it wasn't like that. It's like interesting. We still have some yeshivas like this day where you just picked a shir. You didn't actually, or there was only one yeshiva, Rosh Yeshiva shir. But Tels was the first yeshiva which had classes and a progression from level to level. Now, the yeshivas themselves became divided in the mid-19th century into Mussar yeshivas versus non-Mussar yeshivas. Along came Meoros High and said, people are working on their learning Torah, but they're not working on their midos. And we have people who therefore come out to be great, knowledgeable people, but are not particularly good people, so to speak. Ideally speaking, and this is the alternative approach which existed already at that time, we say if you learn a lot of Torah, you become a good person. Torah gives you good midos. Rabbi Solomon said that might have been true once upon a time, but it's not necessarily true anymore. You can have people who are big Talmidei Chachamim who don't necessarily have good midos. There's a story I heard from one of my rabbeim, which is told in various different versions. I'll give you the version I heard, which is Rabbi Solomon ran a test one Yom Kippur. He came into shul and into yeshiva actually in Vilna, where it was a Rosh Yeshiva, with another co-Rosh Yeshiva who remains nameless for reasons which will become obvious. And he went over to this other Rosh Yeshiva, and he didn't have a machzor. And Rabbi Solomon probably didn't need a machzor. He was extraordinarily brilliant. He probably knew of davening by heart. But he went over to this other Rosh Yeshiva, and he went like this, can I look in with you in your machzor? And the other Rosh Yeshiva went like this, and he elbowed him aside, as if to say, you're not looking at my machzor. This is my avodas Hashem. I don't have to accommodate you in terms when I want to daven, and my kavanah might be diminished. Rabbi Solomon is supposed to have said, and again, this is a legend, I'm not sure 100% how accurate it is, but it makes the point that I had this Rosh Yeshiva thought for a moment what actually Hashem would want of him, that he would have understood that, okay, my kavanah might suffer a little bit, but this other person won't be able to daven at all. So therefore, I certainly should share my machzor with him. So therefore, obviously, he was not thinking about Ratzon Hashem and what good midos would be. He was just thinking about himself and his own personal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that was something which Rabbi Solomon came to combat. He said, you know what? We need to have a specific and independent pursuit of Mussar. Mussar meaning the development of character and personality. And it has to be separate and distinct and a carved out time and even a carved out place, because Rabbi Solomon, when we're supposed to have a special place, which the best of my knowledge we have none left nowadays, called the Beis HaMussar, where people go just for the purpose of working on the midos and learning Mussar. And every place, every town, every yeshiva should have it. And he says specifically, Mussar is not limited to Talmidei Chachamim. Obviously, men, women, and children, everybody can use Mussar and can work on their personalities and character. But when it came to introducing Mussar into yeshivas, it became a big fight. There's a famous story that Rabbi Saul's Talmud, Rabbi Itzla Petterberger, his name was Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer. It was called Rabbi Itzla Petterberger because he had been rabbi in St. Petersburg for a while. He came to Volozhin to try and introduce Mussar in Volozhin. And he was met by the Rosh Yeshiva at the time, Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik. And Rabbi Chaim said to him, Mussar is like castor oil, some sort of medication. If you're sick and you take castor oil, it makes you better. But if you're healthy and you take castor oil, it makes you sick. And we in Volozhin are healthy, so we don't need any castor oil. So therefore, we're not going to introduce Mussar. Now, what does it mean they didn't introduce Mussar? Now, obviously, everybody wants to be a Reish Shamayim. Everybody wants to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even if you're, so to speak, anti-Mussar. It means that it was felt that it's not necessary and detrimental to actually set up a formal a limud, a formal part of learning, and a formal part of the schedule, certainly, for the purpose of learning Mussar, and for the purpose of working on midos. And this became a tremendous split in the yeshiva world between the pro-Mussar yeshivas and anti-Mussar yeshivas. And I want to stress that even anti-Musar yeshiva had a mashgiach. Mashgiach whose job was to make sure that the bachrim, so to speak, this is a little bit oversimplified, getting up for davening, learning properly and so on and so forth. But the mashgiach in a non-Musar yeshiva would not be in charge of his charges, personality and character and their development, just make sure the yeshiva is running properly in terms of everybody doing what they're supposed to be doing. Mashgiach in a Musar yeshiva would actually be concerned with helping people develop their personality and so on and so forth. And there are certain cities, like there's a town called Kovna, which had one suburb called Slobodka, another suburb called Kamenetz. Slobodka had a yeshiva, one of the most famous Musar yeshivas, and Kamenetz had the non-Musar yeshiva. The head of the Kamenetz yeshiva, Rabbi Leib, was a tremendous tzaddik, but they didn't actually learn Musar, pursue Musar in his yeshiva. But Slobodka, where the author from Slobodka was one of the founders, the second generation, but one of the founding fathers of the Musar movement, was the one who ran the yeshiva. Kamenetz actually split off from Slobodka. So this became one issue, the issue of Musar versus non-Musar, and to this day, there are still yeshivas, most famously Brisk, which are anti-Musar, and there are even most yeshivas which are lukewarm towards Musar. In other words, they have a Musar Seder, but it's about 15 minutes a day, and you do whatever you want, and you learn whatever Sefer you want, and really it's working directly on means of personality. And there are very few yeshivas, which actually today work on the character development and stress how important it is for their students. By the way, I'm talking today about non-Hasidic yeshivas. In Hasidic yeshivas, they also learn Musar. Because, again, there's this concept of learning Musar, which is independent of character development and personality and focusing on one's midos. It's just learning Sfarim, which are about Avodas Hashem, Shorim, or Tzadikim and other Sfarim, which you can learn independently of making an entire discipline, an entire pursuit, a psychological drive out of it.
Did the Musar yeshivas produce better character people than the non-Musar?
I don't think anybody took a study, but I think so. Yes, I personally think so.
What about today?
Today, no. Today makes no difference. There's a famous mashal where they say name of Satmar Rebbe, but it could be somebody else said it. It's I don't know, but there's a mashal which says that before he was talking about between Hasidim and Misnagdim, but it applies also to Musar and non-Musar to a large extent today. He said there was once a family in which the father only ate fleshik, and the mother only ate milk, and the son-in-law only ate milchik. So they had to have two separate kitchens in the house, one for the father, one for the son-in-law, and they ate in two separate dining rooms. So eventually the family became impoverished, and they couldn't afford meat or milk anymore, they could only afford potatoes. But still, they kept on having a separate fleshik potatoes kitchen, a separate milchik potatoes kitchen, going through the motions. Until finally they said, you know what, everybody, we're just eating potatoes anyway, might as well just get together. So the Satmar Rebbe is supposed to have said that today there are no real Misnagdim anymore, no real Hasidim anymore, so therefore we might as well just each take from each other whatever we can. And this is also true about Musar versus non-Musar today. Second World War killed many, many trends and many, many schools of thought, which we're not even aware of today. But they, after that, all of this is like Zecher the Churban. We don't have these trends anymore, like we once did.
So why do we learn it?
What?
So why do we learn it?
It's part of the structure. Minhag Avos B'Yadeinu.
Why do we learn the history of this?
Some people think, what?
If the whole thing doesn't apply anymore, why do we learn the history of it?
Why learn the history of it?
Yeah.
Oh, because we hope somebody here will actually be inspired to actually work on their character and personality.
I thought you were going to say the start of yeshiva.
Yeah, that's what I was
No. The start of yeshiva, I always dream of having, when I was younger, I dreamt of starting yeshiva. Now I dreamt what would have been had I started yeshiva. But it always comes back to the people of my friends who have yeshivas. They have almost one preoccupation, which is fundraising. So I don't recommend starting a yeshiva, because it really, for the Rosh Yeshiva, then becomes, unless you're very blessed with a tremendous executive directors are more important than Rosh Yeshiva, because if they take the burden of fundraising of the Rosh Yeshiva can actually be a Rosh Yeshiva, but that's rare.
So you need to be second in charge. So you have to
Yes, right, just Rebbe. Anyway, so, but getting back to the point, so, the points. What developed over time in yeshivas became not to learn, like Volozhin did, the entire Shas over 6 years, but to learn selected Masechtas. And to learn selected Masechtas means there are certain Masechtas which are called Yeshiva and Masechtas. There are certain cycles which yeshivas have in which they learn these Yeshiva and Masechtas. And the reason why they learn these Masechtas is that they are attractive intellectually. There's a lot of abstract thinking, a lot of interesting topics, a lot of things which will be exciting for a young mind. And bear in mind, most yeshivas were focused on teenagers. So therefore, they had to entice the teenagers with some type of learning which would not be boring, because teenagers tend to get bored very easily. So therefore, since that's the fact, you had to have like cute stuff, interesting stuff, engaging stuff, and that's how the yeshiva system developed. And that created a situation where today, most yeshivas learn relatively little, in the sense that they'll learn, if it's a yeshiva which learns fast, 40 or 50 blot in the course of the year. Bear in mind, Shas is over 2,700 blot. So they'll learn 40 or 50 blot in the entire year. If it's a yeshiva which learns slower, like famously Chafetz Chaim, then they will learn maybe 2 or 3 blot in the morning Seder, and in the afternoon they'll learn another 40 or 50. And that brings us to another basic difference.
In Volozhin was around 400 mark, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, because the other basic difference between, basic dichotomy in the yeshivas between learning Be'iyun and learning Be'kiyus. In Volozhin, there's no such distinction, or there are different ways of, different terms which are used in different places, but the idea is the part of the day is devoted to learning slow and analytically, and part of the day is devoted to learning relatively quickly, not very quickly, relatively quickly, and covering more ground and more concepts. So you can learn anything, Be'iyun and Be'kiyus, right? You can learn Tanakh, Be'iyun and Be'kiyus. But in the yeshiva system structure, you learn Gemara in the morning normally, slower, more in depth, with more analysis, and the afternoon and evening more quickly, and less profoundly, more superficially, but in order to get more knowledge. Even then, it's not the same thing as Volozhin. There's certain Masechtas which never get touched, because they're in the part of the non-yeshiva Masechtas. But the more knowledge is covered in the Be'kiyus than is covered in the Iyun. Okay, so that, again, you can imagine Tanakh learning the same way. You probably experience it yourselves, that there's certain parts of Tanakh you learn slowly, in depth, and other parts you learn quickly in order to just cover ground and get knowledge. So this that became one hallmark of the yeshiva system, the difference between Iyun and Be'kiyus. Another became the focus on shir. In other words, it became there are certain popular Magidei shir, some popular Rosh Yeshiva whose shir are considered to be particularly analytical and probably, although this is not the term used, entertaining. And people would go to those yeshivas in order to get those lectures, the shurim of those Rosh Yeshiva. And they became more popular, obviously, because they were very engaging. And again, young students had to be entertained, not just taught. Famous, I shouldn't say famous, there's an interesting story about Reb Pesach Pruskin. Reb Pesach Pruskin was Reb Moshe Feinstein's Rebbe in yeshiva. Reb Moshe Feinstein went to his yeshiva, and Reb Pesach was originally a mashgiach, and he gave a lower shir, and the Bachram evidently made fun of him that he didn't know how to learn so well. He wasn't so erudite, he wasn't so analytical, and then he davened, and he became, evidently there was a dream involved, I forget the exact story, and he became much better at giving an exciting shir, and the yeshiva changed it as a result, and he became much popular Rosh Yeshiva. Anyway, so the idea is that the yeshiva became more specialized and more devoted to the Masechtas, which were found to be engaging. Now this means that people didn't have the same knowledge they once had. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was critical of this, nothing to do with Musar per se, but he said that he really felt that people should be learning much more and covering much more ground, like they did in Volozhin. And he was critical of the new way of learning where people actually focused on a relatively little amount of ground. This also changed the way of learning because in Volozhin, people became masters of Shas, and therefore they could cross-reference many different things in analyzing every issue they learned. Whereas today, we don't have that skill anymore in yeshivas because we don't know that much. Now, today we have other tools, computerized tools which help us look stuff up so you can become instantly knowledgeable. But before those things came about, you had a long period of time where most people did not, even in the yeshiva system, they were profoundly analytical, but they didn't necessarily know so much. So there was this, and it hasn't changed that much despite the advent of computerized databases. So the question became, however, did you have to learn in yeshiva? And this became a major issue in terms of, can a person actually sit in a shul somewhere or sit at home and learn without being in a yeshiva? And will he be successful in life in finding a job, in finding a good shidduch, and so on and so forth? So it used to be that it was understood that you didn't have to go to yeshiva. And famously, the Chazon Ish never actually learned in a yeshiva. He learned on his own his entire life. Other people didn't learn in yeshivas. They learned with Rabbanim or with Malamdim, but it became a system. And it's just understood today, if you're not part of the system, there's something wrong. And this is what's fundamental principle about educational institutions of all sorts nowadays. They're not just there for education. As a matter of fact, in some institutions, you probably are being educated more poorly because you're in that school, because you'll do better on your own. But they're sociological institutions in the sense that you actually have to be in that institution in order to fit in with your society. Otherwise, you're regarded as a misfit. And then in Lithuania, before the war, and in other places, the yeshivas were specifically supposed to be for the elite who wanted to learn in that specific way. Most people did not go to yeshiva. The yeshivas were not meant to be a mass movement. They were meant to be for individuals who are going to try to be the Gdolei Torah, the Rosh Yeshiva, the Rabbanim of the next generation. They weren't meant for everybody, Tom, Dick, and Harry, to go to yeshiva because that was the place to be. Today, the way yeshivas work are, if you're not in yeshiva, then what's wrong with you? Why are you not in yeshiva? And everybody goes to yeshivas. Now, the problem is that the structure of the yeshiva did not change in order to deal with that new reality. Once upon a time, when yeshivas were for the elite, so the way yeshivas learned made a lot of sense, because they basically people learned independently. Most of the studies independently. Yeshiva is a very small part of the day. You learned independently, and you learned to a certain extent, at least earlier more, later less, at your own, the way you wanted to learn, even at your own, except for, obviously in Volozhin it was not that way, but in most places at your own pace to a certain extent. You go faster than the shear, slower than the shear, and you learned what in a way which was appealing to you. Of course, you learned almost exclusively Gemara, because that's what yeshivas do. That was understood to be the way you open up people's minds for more profound analysis, in the sense of making them great thinkers in Torah. So therefore, Gemara became the focus. But the problem is that the truth is that most kids have great problems with Gemara. Now, people ask me very often, I shouldn't say so very often, but occasionally they ask me why we don't teach girls Gemara in let's say the right-wing system. Why do Beis Yaakovs not teach Gemara? And the simple answer to that I give, although it's somewhat flippant, but I believe it's true, is that we ruined the boys' education. You also want us to ruin the girls' education. By that I mean that if you come out of an outstanding high school like Meoros, then with a good education, then you have knowledge some knowledge of Tanakh, some knowledge of Halacha, some knowledge of Jewish history. You may even be able to speak a smattering of Hebrew. But if you go to Yeshiva High School, the average Yeshiva High School day, you come out after your 4 years of high school knowing very few blot and a very few Masechtas, no Jewish history, because it's not taken seriously in most yeshivas, and no Tanakh, because that's not taken seriously in most yeshivas, and no Ivrit, because it's not taught in most yeshivas. So you girls will come out of high school much better educated, well-rounded Jews than if you went to a boys' school. The problem is that most boys could use that type of education as well, and they're not getting it. So they come out functionally illiterate when it comes to Judaism. Not even talking about secular studies, because that's a whole other issue. So the question is, a system which is based on producing great minds of next generation and was not geared for the masses. Masses were expected to go out at a young age to work, to apprentice themselves to some trade, is appropriate for everybody. And it still remains an open question today. And it's interesting because we have in Judaism distinctions between the right-wing Orthodox or yeshivish or Haredi and the left-wing Orthodox or modern Orthodox. Every yeshiva which exists today, even the most modern ones, are still based on the Volozhin system. That Gemara is considered primary. I taught many years ago in a co-ed school in New Jersey, and for the girls' honors track, they learned Gemara. They learned an additional period of Gemara, which is totally useless for them, because even if they went on to when they went on to seminary or to wherever else they went on, there'd be no future for them in Gemara. That's the reality of the way the educational system is structured. But since the boys were learning Gemara, and because in Volozhin the focus is on Gemara, so too the focus was when they wanted to make the girls have a more expanded, so to speak, honors track, they just gave them more Gemara instead of giving them what should be actually more useful for both boys and girls, certainly in a more modern school, which would be more Judaism, which they again forgot very little of. Halacha, Hashkafa, Chshava, Tanakh, all those things. So, but the yeshiva system, again, remains what it once was, even though it may not be suitable for the masses. What is your opinion about this, Rabbi Federer?
I agree with everything you're saying so far.
Any questions so far? Everybody's been very quiet. Are you just stunned into silence? Or are you totally bored? Okay, so in any event, so as I said,
No question? What is that question?
maybe my wife told me once that the average teacher waits after having posed a question to the class for 4 seconds. That's the most they'll actually wait, because after 4 seconds they're afraid they'll lose control of the class. 4 seconds of silence is very, very uncomfortable. So I used to say, you know what, I'll wait 30 seconds and see if anybody comes up with a question. So I'm willing to do that if necessary, but you should try and come up with questions if you have any. But getting back to the, try to leave time at the end for sure, another 5 minutes. But getting back to...
What's the difference between the American system and the Israeli system?
The American system basically allows for recreation. In most of the American Israeli yeshivas, you probably won't find a basketball court. And and Hasidic yeshivas, you definitely won't find a basketball court. And also secular studies. In most American yeshivas, there's still some form, although in Lakewood, many yeshivas do not have them, but most of them still have some secular studies in high school, whereas in Israel, you'll find no secular studies in many right-wing yeshivas. A few other differences, which are Israelis, because they know Hebrew, they make much more progress earlier, but then it kind of had one of my uncles was the Rosh Yeshiva once said to me at age 22, it more or less evens out. Even though they have more of a basis, but then Americans tend to catch up when they're a little bit more quickly later on.
Israelis don't believe in recreation?
No, not really. No, and Hasidim don't believe in recreation. So I want to talk about that in a moment for the Chassidishe yeshivas and non-Chassidish yeshivas. Most Chassidish yeshiva studies are structured as the same as non-Chassidish yeshivas, as what we call Litvishe yeshivas. They have the same structure, they learn the same way. There used to be a very different derech in Europe, which Chassidish yeshivas had, and yeshivas in general developed later in Chassidish locations, because it was understood that more people went out to work and very few people actually stayed to study. This spread from Lithuania to other places very gradually. But there were famous yeshivas, such as in Pressburg, the Chasam Sofer's yeshiva, and other places as well, But and of course there's Chachmei Lublin in Poland, and as yeshivas though they were very not much different than the yeshivas in Lithuania, where Volozhin started the movement. And today I happen to have a job. It's a great job, which is one of my many jobs and part-time jobs. Is I go from yeshiva to yeshiva, and I assess the yeshivas for accreditation as colleges. And part of that is I go and I go to teach yeshiva, and I speak to talmidim there, and I talk to them in learning. And I talk about the yeshiva, and usually they send me their best talmidim to speak to them learning. So I go to places in Lakewood and in Monroe and Muncie and across the entire United States, and see the different yeshivas and how they function. And the Hasidic yeshivas and Litvishe yeshivas are very much similar, but the Hasidim have a slightly different orientation in not their learning, which is structured the same, but in terms of their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. At least they think they do. And I think that they do in the sense that they have a greater focus on the avodas Hashem, such as things in davening, even though Litvishe yeshivas davening is very, very important, but things like focus on davening and doing things with a sense of Shivisi Hashem L'nei Tamid is much more, I shouldn't say much more, somewhat more prevalent in Hasidic yeshivas than in Mishnayos yeshivas, where the assumption again still is through learning you get everything. You don't have to focus on other things independently. The only system which is interestingly different is Chabad. Chabad actually has learning of Chassidus 3 hours a day. No other Chassidus has that type of learning.
3 hours a day?
3 hours a day, an hour and a half in the morning, an hour and a half at night, which no other yeshiva has. Most of the Chassidus yeshivas don't even have formal structured time for Chassidus. The Bochrim build it in on their own. But in Chabad, they actually do have structured time for Chassidus. But their learning of Gemara is more or less the same learning as everybody else. It's not different than the yeshiva system. Now, what is the derech of learning? It's not really time for us to get into in detail today, but most yeshivas, they have the same derech in learning, and that's called the brisker derech. And that's a bit of a tragedy, because there used to be many more drachim in learning, many different ways of analyzing a Gemara, of analyzing a topic, from different angles and different tools and methodologies. Again, it'll take a long time to get into detail, but most of those, it was kind of like a competition, and most of those other ways of learning have fallen by the wayside for whatever reasons. And the brisker derech is one which focuses, and Rabbi Farragut, I'm sure, can speak about this at great length when he has an opportunity, on categorization. What is this? What is that? In other words, for example, if you have a mitzvah, is a mitzvah which is a mitzvah which is incumbent on the person, what's called the gavra, what the person has to do, or is an halacha in the chefza, what the status of an object. There's a famous example which is given is the difference between something which is Asur D'Oraisa and Asur Rabban. Not everybody gives a reason for this analysis, but I'm going to give it as an example. Something which is Asur D'Oraisa, the Torah forbade, is an Isser Chefza. The object itself is a forbidden object. The Rabbanan, they can't make an object a forbidden object. They can come and say, don't eat it. They can't say, this is a piece of pig. It's not a piece of pig, right? But they can say, don't eat it. So they can make halacha on the gavra, on the person. They can't make halacha which has to do with the chefza. And Rabbi Farragut can explain this at great length, as I'm sure he will. But the idea is that there are certain tools of categorization. I say this relates to this, that relates to that. They say, in Brisk, what is not supposed to ask why, only what. In other words, there is no concept of why, because why? It's all because of Ratzon Hashem. Hashem wanted it to be this way. But what is very, very significant. And you can say, well, this is X and this is Y. Why this is X, why that's Y, that doesn't concern me so much. And again, I don't really have time to get into this, and that's why I'm leaving it for my son-in-law. But if you categorize things very, very precisely, you tend to think that you understand them profoundly. And that's why there's certain tools which they use which make people perceive they understand things in a way which is profound, even though it might not be the most profound way of looking at things because you don't want to look at the why. I'll give you an example of looking at a why. There is a concept of Tok Dibur Kedibur Dami. Again, this requires more discussion, but if I have to make a bracha, it's the wrong bracha. I say Bari Piragaf, and I meant to say Bari Minei Mizonos. So if it's within the amount of time, Tok Kedei Dibur, meaning a split second or two, after I finish the bracha, Tok Kedei Dibur Kedibur Dami, within the amount of time, it's considered as if it's the same, as if I haven't finished what I said, and I can go back and change. Right? So I can go back and say, Shakali Varo, Bari Piragaf, whatever the case may be. The complex halachas, but that's the basic principle. So why is Tok Kedibur Kedibur Dami? Why should I be allowed to change in that amount of time and not be allowed to change after that amount of time? So that requires, you could say, well, that's the Chazal made it, decided, that's the halacha. Chazal said that this is the case. That would be if I looked at it from a what perspective. But from why perspective, like, and that's, the derech used to be prevalent in the yeshiva called Telshe, and the most famous associated with Rav Shimon Shkop. Again, these are names that might not mean anything to, but maybe someday they will. So then the tells they would say there is the thought process of human being continues after they have finished saying something. We speak quicker than we think, and therefore, even after I say something for a split second or two, I'm still focused on that thing which I said. And he said, tells Rosh Yeshiva, yesterday Bluff said, check it out. If you just finish Shmon Esrei, and somebody immediately says something to you, even though you finish Shmon Esrei, you'll still feel that you were interrupted in the middle of Shmon Esrei. Why? Because it takes a moment for the mind to come down from that plateau. And therefore he says, that's why Tok Kedibur Kedibur Dami. And he brings a language from one of the Rishonim who says, Rechushem Rachshon Sivasa. Your lips are still mumbling after you finish speaking. It's not literal, but it's figurative. So these are the ideas this is a sample of different drachim, which again takes a long time to get into. I once wrote an analysis of different darchei limud based on a cup of tea, but maybe I can share this after Pesach. But I'll just share briefly. There was a question. They say that in yeshivos they used to question, what makes the tea sweet? Is it the sugar or the spoon? Is because the sugar makes tea sweet, but if you don't stir the sugar, it's not going to be sweet. So how do you look at it? Is it the sugar which makes the tea sweet, or the spoon which makes the tea sweet? Is that the end of the period? Okay. So then I wrote a whole analysis how different yeshivas would have looked at that idea. But that's obviously, we're over time. Are there any quick questions? Because since we ran out of time, we don't have much time for questions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.